Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right into the intense, high-stakes race for the Americas, and we're looking at how different European powers shaped the vastly different societies they built there. The Americas quickly became a place of stark contrasts, and understanding how these early settlements formed is literally the key to understanding our modern cultural landscape. Here's a quick look at our agenda. We are going to break down the complex empires of the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English into a few distinct themes: their economies, labor systems, religion, and early forms of self-government. All right, let's get into it.
Section 1. The European Colonial Race. So, let's start at the exact moment these previously isolated groups first came into contact. This sequence of events happened incredibly fast. Back in 1492, Columbus's letters to Spain sparked immense excitement, which completely inaugurated an era of aggressive expansion. By the 1500s, Spain was absolutely the dominant power. But the English eventually outpaced their rivals. They set up Jamestown in 1607, followed closely by the Pilgrims in 1620. Later on, we see new colonies established after the English monarchy was restored to power in the 1660s under King Charles II.
Moving right along to Section 2, Regional Economies and Wealth.
Let's see how this all builds into the specific economic motives that drove each empire. The absolutely crucial point here is that mercantilism drove colonization. These colonies existed purely to enrich their mother country. Mercantilists didn't really believe in free trade. Instead, they believed there was a strictly finite amount of wealth in the world, which they measured in gold and silver bullion. Under this protectionist system, colonies were forced to send their harvested raw materials back home, and they could only purchase finished goods directly from their mother country.
What's really fascinating is how these empires extracted that wealth so differently. Spain focused on mining literal silver and gold. They discovered massive veins of silver ore in South America, turning places like Potosi into huge boomtowns. On the flip side, English migrants in the Chesapeake Bay area realized pretty quickly that growing cash crops, specifically tobacco, was their surest ticket to making money. Meanwhile, the French and the Dutch utilized the environment in a completely different way, focusing heavily on the fur trade. And that trade was so intense, it actually led to the overhunting and near extinction of beavers in the Northeast.
Which brings us to Section 3, Comparing Colonial Labor Systems.
To maintain these massive, resource-draining economies, the colonists faced a crushing, desperate demand for physical labor. The Spanish utilized something called the encomienda system. Under this, authorities assigned native workers to conquistadors who could prove their service to the crown. Effectively, they forced native peoples into grueling labor to fuel the expansion of the Spanish Empire, all under the strict guise that the owners would defend the colony and teach the workers Catholicism. It was pure exploitation, which was later replaced by a very similar system known as the repartimento.
Let's compare this directly. While Spain initially exploited native populations, the English, in places like Virginia, first relied on white indentured servants. These were often unemployed, impatient young Englishmen hoping for a better life working the tobacco fields. But as the demand for labor to grow cash crops like sugar and tobacco skyrocketed, the English made a tragic, brutal shift to African chattel slavery, a system where human beings were legally classified as mere personal property. By 1672, the Royal African Company was chartered, monopolizing the transport of enslaved African people and deeply cementing this horrific institution into colonial law.
Okay, let's do a quick pause check. Think about this. Why did New England end up with a much more stable workforce than the Chesapeake colonies? Consider who exactly was traveling to these different regions.
Well, the answer lies in who actually made the journey. The New Englanders migrated as entire family units, creating a self-sustaining workforce completely unlike the solitary cash crop laborers down in the Chesapeake. New England towns actively protected their disciplined, homegrown workforce of children and relatives, often just outright refusing to allow outsiders in. This created a very powerful, stable, maritime-based economy.
All right, Section 4, Religion and Social Orders.
Faith and beliefs really dictated the entire social hierarchy of these new settlements. Down in New Spain, a patriarchal, top-down society placed Spanish men at the very top of the social pyramid, with a heavy emphasis on converting Native Americans to Catholicism. Meanwhile, the English Puritan towns of New England were hyper-focused on their tight-knit Protestant congregations. They envisioned building a new English Israel, where Reformed Protestantism would absolutely thrive and serve as a model for the rest of the world.
Just listen to the pressure in this famous quote from John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He said, "They must be as a city upon a hill." This brilliantly captures the Puritans' immense pressure to be a flawless moral model for the rest of the Christian world.
They truly, literally believed the eyes of all people were upon them.
Time for another pause check. How did these wildly differing social and religious motives actually trigger the massive cultural fault lines between the American North and South?
Historians point to this exact divergence as the root of that divide. The South, originating in the Chesapeake colonies, was built on commercial profit, cash crops, and an influx of young, single men. The North, rooted in New England, was fundamentally established by pious Puritan families who prioritized church, community values, and religious freedom. It's a huge contrast.
Now into Section 5, Emerging Forms of Self-Government.
Let's dive into how these unique societies began to actually govern themselves in the New World. The Mayflower Compact, signed in 1620 by 41 Pilgrim men in Plymouth Harbor, is incredibly significant. It laid the groundwork for community working together under a shared set of rules. Presenting a religious rather than an economic rationale for colonization, it's often been called the first American governing document, predating the U.S. Constitution by over 150 years. That is a monumental step for self-governance.
But look at how government differed depending on the colony's origins. While Pilgrims in New England were experimenting with early self-rule through their congregational churches, the English monarchy was simultaneously trying to consolidate its own power. During the Restoration in the 1660s, when the English monarchy regained the throne, King Charles II handed out massive tracts of land, like Pennsylvania, to William Penn, and the Carolinas to his loyal proprietors. These proprietary colonies gave individuals or families absolute, basically feudal-style control over entire regions.
And finally, Section 6, Recap and Final Thoughts.
We've covered a massive amount of historical ground in this explainer today. To quickly recap, European colonization definitely wasn't a single story. It was a complex web of varying motives. Spain drove an empire based on mercantilist wealth extracted through native exploitation. The French and the Dutch focused on the fur trade. And within the English Empire itself, the Chesapeake colonies prioritized commercial cash crops built on the tragedy of chattel slavery, while the New England colonies focused on family, religious conformity, and community-driven self-rule.
I want to leave you with this final transfer question to analyze on your own. How do you think these deeply ingrained colonial motives, the pursuit of wealth versus the pursuit of religious perfection, shaped the cultural divides of the United States? Think deeply about how the echoes of these early fault lines still impact the country today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.